The older I get, the more I realize that great gameplay tends to trump all other aspects that are available in a game. Don't get me wrong, I love awesome stories, cutting-edge graphics, and all that jazz. While that's true, the majority of the indie games I play tend to focus more on gameplay. It might be due to working with limited budgets, or that's simply what some indie devs want to focus on. I don't know. What I do know is that despite Bleak Sword making great use of 8-bit graphics, it still delivers an awesome experience. It was to the point where I played most of it within a handful of days, and that's not the case with every game I play. Chances are that it's due to the simple 8-bit graphics being used that it was decided to make that stand out in other ways. Simply put, Bleak Sword is very cinematic. It's not only due to its many cutscenes, which are impressive for stick figures / 8-bit characters, it's also during the gameplay itself. The levels are little dioramas that are more like battle arenas. The point is to take out X number of enemies before being able to advance to the next level. That probably sounds too simple, but what makes this stand out is the use of great camera angles. It's not just top-down like other similar games. What comes to mind are fixed camera angle survival horror games. Some might think that simply making use of fixed camera angles makes a game look as impressive as Remake 1, but it also takes a great eye to decide where and how to set up the angle. For the most part, I'd say that was the case, but it wasn't like that in some levels. I sometimes fall back on cliché sayings more often than I would like, but it's because they get the job done. In the case of Bleak Sword and its occasional bad use of camera angles, what comes to mind is that less is more. What I mean is that some levels had bad camera angles due to columns or other similar objects blocking the view. Not only did this lead to offering less of a visual experience, it unintentionally made things harder. On a scale of 1 to 10, Bleak Sword was around 6 when it came to its overall difficulty. Every now and then there were levels and enemies that made things much harder, so it started to feel more like an 8 or 9. As if dealing with tougher enemies and limited abilities wasn't bad enough, attempting to maneuver around tight spaces with limited vision made things harder than they needed to be. I don't consider this to be horrible to the point where it made me want to play less often. It was, however, an annoyance that could have been avoided. Bleak Sword's gameplay showcases that having the basics covered helps more than some may realize. This isn't a platformer, but it's still great being able to feel your weight when moving around. I like this because it helped me feel more immersed in the game, and as if my playstyles / overall decisions genuinely made a difference. It's not that this isn't the case in other games, but sometimes you're left with too much recovery room, so even if you make too many mistakes, you're always on the path towards success. In a nutshell, you could say that some games offer too much hand-holding, and I'm not a big fan of that. Bleak Sword makes you own up to your mistakes and forces you to acknowledge and correct them. That wasn't the case for all of Bleak Sword, seeing as how the early to mid game wasn't as challenging. That may sound boring to some, but what's great about BS is that it knew how to balance things out. The combat was the focal point of BS, but sometimes things like the environment affecting gameplay was a cherry on top. Some examples include sliding around on ice/snow areas and dealing with environmental obstacles. I thought that was great because it made it so that you had to focus on multiple things at once. Sometimes that can be overwhelming, but the truth is, I like multitasking. Not only that, I like it when a game forces me to think strategically. It's not to the point as say when I'd play League of Legends or currently play CS2, but it was enough to make a positive impression. Despite being a fan of games such as BS and the many Soulsborne games, I pretty much never rely on parrying. I'm more of a block and dodge kind of guy. What stood out to me about BS is that it's very parry friendly. I realize that me saying this makes me come off as a hypocrite because I previously mentioned that I dislike too much hand holding, but I viewed this differently. The parry system in BS gives you plenty of room to see attacks coming and react. With other games, it's as if your reaction time has to be instantaneous and there's no real room for mistakes. Some may appreciate that for the challenge, but I prefer when it's more towards the middle. Though I did enjoy the parry system due to how useful it was for offensive and defensive purposes, I wish I'd learned sooner that more attacks could be parried. It's because I assumed that I could only parry attacks from enemies that were around my size. This is due to some of the enemies being much larger than your character and making use of very heavy attacks. You'd think that the slower the attack, the better off you'd be parrying them, but that wasn't the case. For the most part, these heavy attacks couldn't be parried, so your only option was to dodge. I thought this was the case for longer than I can recall. Had I learned that the parry system wasn't as limited as I initially thought it was, I could have saved myself a lot of time. It's not only because parrying disrupted your enemy's attacks and prevented you from taking damage, but also because it gave you a small boost. It helped restore your stamina and made your attacks a little stronger. This was especially useful towards the middle and end of BS due to how hard some of the levels were. I have more positive than negative things to say about BS's parrying system, but I also felt that it could sometimes be too forgiving. This came to mind when I realized that I could parry even when it was almost too late. It helped me more than once, but I felt that it could have been tightened up. I understand that I probably come off as all over the place by praising one thing about the parry system and then criticizing for doing another. My point is that it could have offered all of the pros while making some of the cons less of a thing, or even straight up not have them be part of the game. In continuing to discuss BS's gameplay/combat, it's worth mentioning that it makes use of friendly fire, and I love that. I'm pretty sure that I've brought this up in past reviews, but one of the reasons why I love being able to use friendly fire against enemies is because it leads to a greater degree of strategic gameplay. Not only that, it's one more tactic to rely on when you're either too overwhelmed or simply feel like changing up your playstyle. What's confusing is that even though some attacks cause friendly fire, others pass through enemies without consequences. This is kind of related to how I feel about BS's parrying system. In its current state, this friendly fire system feels imbalanced. I'd prefer it to be all or nothing. Either all enemy attacks can lead to friendly fire, or none of them do. As it stands, the result is having to guess and check which attacks can cause friendly fire, and I don't like that. For the most part, I got the idea that projectile attacks were more likely to cause friendly fire. That's understandable, but then you've got attacks by large enemies that affect a decent amount of space, and yet you're the only one affected by it. The result is a system that feels like it wasn't as well polished as it could have been. On that note, it's worth mentioning that BS's achievements were in fact well thought out. I like that a lot because these were interesting achievements. There were a few that can be seen as basic, such as eliminate X number of enemies, but there were others that were more specific. A few that come to mind are killing 2 enemies at once, getting enemies to hit each other, or something like beating a level with no damage. Over the years, I've come to the conclusion that I prefer achievements that I don't need to go out of my way to get. Chances are that leaves you wondering, so what's the point of even having them if you're getting them without even realizing they're a thing? It's because I view these achievements as a sort of pat on the back. When achievements go out of their way to be complex and force me to do a lot to get them, I feel overwhelmed. When it's not like that and I'm getting them by simply playing the game, it's as if my playstyle/skill is being celebrated. One of the reasons why BS stood out to me in the way that it did was because of how it was able to keep me playing. I'm sure that most devs/games go out of their way to accomplish this, but it's easier said than done. It's not only because of the positive things that I've already mentioned, but because of how short the levels were. Some might hear that and assume that's a bad thing, but it's not when the experience is short and sweet. It largely had to do with the number of enemies that had to be taken out per level. At first, it was possible to take care of them in less than a minute. This was largely due to them being basic enemies that could be killed in a handful of hits. As BS went on, this started to change. Not only did I have to take out more enemies, they became stronger, more varied, and this led to a longer/more challenging experience. For the most part, I found this to be enjoyable, but I eventually started to feel frustrated. It's because some levels and enemies came off as harder to beat than the final boss. That's a trend I've started to notice in modern games, and that makes me wonder why this is happening. It could just be my skills as a player affecting how I perceive things, but I think there's more to it than that. Bleak Sword is the kind of game that can be described as short and sweet. I spent more time playing it than I felt was necessary due to how challenging some of the later levels were. Still, despite some frustrating moments, I felt that Bleak Sword did a good job when it came to balancing its difficulty. It also helped that whenever you had the option of upgrading your health thanks to accumulating enough experience points, your overall health would be restored. This was a much needed favor because of how quickly damage would add up. It was possible to get healing items or simply not get hit, but those moments didn't occur frequently, and that was easier said than done. I bring this up because some other games would make it so that your overall health is increased, but your HP bar is left as is. Some might view this as an example of hand-holding, but I see it more as a helping hand that's offered to you every once in a while. I knew I greatly enjoyed Bleak Sword because of how I played through it within a couple of days. When I beat it and saw how much unlocked content was available, I knew that Bleak Sword offers a great level of replay value. It's there even without this additional content, but something like the randomizer mode makes it so that you're encouraged to keep playing. Bleak Sword isn't a roguelike, but I still recognize that some aspects of that subgenre are present. Seeing as how some rogues offer a lot of playtime, it's easy to see how those elements in Bleak Sword add to its overall enjoyment. Simply put, Bleak Sword is an awesome game. Like I previously mentioned, I beat it within a few play sessions and I was left wanting to play more. I have no idea how much playtime I could end up getting out of the randomizer mode, but depending on its difficulty and length, chances are that it's enough to keep me feeling like Bleak Sword offers a truly worthwhile experience. Bleak Sword is very much a don't judge a book by its cover kind of game. It makes use of retro-styled graphics and gameplay, but there's more to it than that. Whether it was the interesting look of the diorama levels, or the use of cinematic cutscenes and in-game angles to make it stand out more than it already did. can see some being unwilling to give Bleak Sword a try due to how difficult some of the later levels can be, but it's a challenge worth trying. Lastly, this game is one of the reasons why I love indie games. Like I said, it doesn't seem like much when you take a glance at it, but it's the creativity of the devs that takes Bleak Sword to the next level. How do you feel about retro-styled graphics being used in this day and age? Is there an art/graphical style that you're just not into? How do you feel about some general enemies being harder to beat than a final boss? If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching.